I wanted to do a video on an interesting paper I read titled Silent Witness: A Moss Provides Important Evidence in Solving a Cemetery Crime by Von Conrad et al., available for free to read online, link attached to this video below. This article is super interesting because in this investigation, police and scientists use archaeological methods to solve a crime, in this case, a crime of grave robbing at Burr Oaks Cemetery, located in Alsip, Illinois, United States, southwest Chicago. A cemetery established in 1927, serving the needs of the African American communities there for close to 100 years now. The final resting place of many of America's first black leaders in politics, business, athletics, faith leaders, and entertainment. For example, interred here at Burr Oaks Cemetery are Otha Lee Moore, better known as Tiny Topsy, an American R&B singer of the 1940s and 1950s. J. Mayo Inc. Williams, a pioneering African-American producer of recorded blues music in the early 20th century. William J. Warfield, an officer in the Illinois National Guard and a state legislature, elected in Illinois in 1928. Graham Turner Perry, an African-American attorney who served as the first assistant attorney general for the state of Illinois, elected in 1941. Tuli McAdoo, an American baseball first baseman in the African American baseball leagues at that time. He played from 1908 to 1924, making him one of the earliest baseball players. Baseball was officially desegregated in 1947. And also at Burr Oaks are the final resting places of Emmett Till and his mother, Mamie Elizabeth Till Mulby. The horrific murder of her son, often cited as the catalyst for the fight towards racial justice in the United States. God rest their souls. Now, when I was in university, I took a class called the Archaeology of Inequality. Inequality here referring to the status of people reflected in their deaths, something that is inferred from grave belongings, but also location. The Burr Oaks Cemetery is a prestigious cemetery in America because of the notable early heroes and inspirational African Americans who rest here. Sadly, this means that there is also an economic incentive here. In other words, people are willing to pay more for their loved ones to rest alongside these early African American heroes and inspirational leaders. Now, the 2009 incident at Burr Oaks Cemetery was technically grave robbing, but this was not the grave robbing of Victorian England when criminals dug up bodies for doctors and scientists studying human anatomy, but rather, at Burr Oaks, employees were essentially double selling grave plots. Poor, unsuspecting people bought grave plots at Burr Oaks Cemetery that cemetery employees emptied or desecrated by digging up older graves of people long since deceased, and then redepositing the older deceased individuals along the outskirts of the cemetery. The police and scientists together built a chronology of events based on the predictable growth pattern of moss found with some of the human remains at the Burr Oaks Cemetery. The desecrated remains were deposited on the outskirts of the same cemetery. In total, 29 individual graves were removed from their original resting places within the cemetery and then placed closer to the perimeter of the site away from the graveyard proper. This is an aerial photo of the Burr Oaks Cemetery. The environment here will be extremely important as it relates to the distribution of the moss Physidens taxiophilus. Physidens is the genus, Taxiophilus the species, but it's better known as common pocket moss, a very common species, hence the name, distributed in the northern hemisphere. So local police were able to identify the crime, locate the buried bodies, and they closed the cemetery in 2009. Exactly how the police knew about the crime was not related to the public to the best of my knowledge. Nevertheless, the crime was alerted to the police, and 4 graveyard employees were arrested and charged with desecrating 29 graves. So the 4 suspects, innocent until proven guilty, they simply asserted that the bodies found along the outskirts of the cemetery had to have been placed there before they were hired by the cemetery 4 years ago because, well, how could the police possibly prove that these 4 employees had done it? Without witnesses, without confessions, without any video evidence. Well, the answer came from a green moss found in association with the bodies, common pocket moss, Physidens taxiophilus. This was found here, above the bodies, approximately 8 inches from the surface of one of the bodies of the reburial mound. So it acts here as a kind of temporal marker. That is because it was still green when the desecrated bodies the crimes were discovered. This image is not of the crime, it is from an unrelated article called Anthropological Approach to Archaeology, a 2007 paper by Sri Lankan students, Thaharka Anada and Karamali Nahalaj, from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology there in Sri Lanka, but I'm using it as an example, as a rough template to convey to you a sense of the physical context of the crime. And thanks to anthropologist Dr. Anne Lee Gurer, lots of difficult names today, who first argued that a timeline of when the crime took place could be reconstructed based on the moss, which was found not only green but alive. Well, technically in a dormant state, something characteristic of hardy moss species writ large. Moss, like all plants, respond predictably to known environmental variables affecting its growth patterns and overall health and condition. In America, when scientific data is used like this in a criminal case, it's referred to as a Fryer hearing, FYRE, when scientists themselves are questioned as sort of witnesses for either the prosecution or defense when they present their data. Now, the task for the prosecution in this case was to create a timeline based on physical evidence, in this case the moss found in association with the human remains, which disproves the stated timeline of events argued by the four suspects. So first, the prosecution had to collect local environmental data. Now, because the moss was still green, the obvious deduction made was that the bodies were buried there recently. But how to prove a human being was behind the moss and not the result of an animal burrowing or environmentally deposited, like from a flooding event, transporting the moss through natural means into the softer soil where the desecrated remains were found, rather than the result of human agency? Well, after a site survey, it was determined that the common pocket moss was not found naturally at the location where the desecrated bodies were found, but it was found naturally near grave plot section 5, lot 3, a lightly shaded area beneath trees at Burr Oaks Cemetery. I don't have access to where exactly this is at Burr Oaks, but for argument's sake, let's say it's here, at this location provided via Google Maps, where grave plots are available, and that the desecrated bodies were illegally buried somewhere along the perimeter of the site, away from the graveyard proper. This was crucial because it ruled out the possibility of animal activity or environmental disposition from wind or water, these two depositional possibilities being more restricted in physical distance. In other words, the moss was found at the grave plots where the bodies were removed, but not found naturally at the outskirts of the cemetery where the bodies were placed. So the suspects unknowingly transported moss from Section 5, Lot 3 to the outskirts of the cemetery when they reburied the most recent desecrated bodies. Now, because the moss found with the bodies retained its green color, botanists took the sample and exposed it to ideal growth conditions in a laboratory, and after a few days the moss regenerated back to life, indicating a few cells in the moss were still alive when the police uncovered the bodies, and the moss must have been alive when the hole was first dug to deposit at least one of the bodies. So then, local precipitation or rain data was collected for the region around Burr Oaks Cemetery within a radius of 13.68 kilometers or 8.5 miles. Data provided by the U.S. Department of Commerce National Data Center. It turned out that in 2009, the area around Burr Oaks Cemetery experienced above average precipitation, above average rain, enough rainfall to penetrate fully into the soil where the moss was found. This is a direct quote from page 3 of the article. It was hypothesized that if a moss plant was in the soil and in a dark environment in combination with a high moisture regime, the moss would soon die and decay. To test this theory, natural history collections were utilized, physiological experiments were conducted, and biological expertise was pooled from biophytes, the association with moss. So because the moss was alive, botanists on the case had to demonstrate the maximum time the moss was in the ground, reflecting the time when the holes to place the bodies were dug. In other words, when the crime took place. Remember, the suspects claimed that it must have happened before they were hired 4 years ago. Moss, one of the first plant life forms to migrate from the ocean to the land 425 to 475 million years ago, Moss is one of the most resilient and hardy plants on land. Biophytes or mosses are poikiliohydric, meaning they lack the ability to retain water independently of their environment. So if it's dry outside, the moss is dry. If it's wet, the moss has more water. This quality helps biophytes like common pocket moss to enter into a dormant state and initiate a controlled cell shutdown, but not die in extreme conditions. This quality helps mosses survive winters and dry seasons. Upon the reintroduction of water and increased temperatures, biophytes are able to regenerate themselves quickly, turning green again surprisingly quickly, actually. So, in our example, no sunlight meant no photosynthesis, so no food, no growth. The moss itself had no access to sunlight nor carbon dioxide, but was still green and alive. Buried common moss can only retain green leaves up to usually at most 8 weeks after burial unless frozen, and this moss was not found frozen, just buried, green, and still alive. Only a few cells of the moss were left alive when it was regenerated. In other words, it was very close to being dead despite regenerating. The age of the moss was determined by measuring its ability to photosynthesize, because light absorption is retained to cellular pigments like chlorophyll, which decreases predictably over time. Related, that is. The growth rate of the moss found at the cemetery was compared to other moss of the same species of known ages, and it was determined the moss found at the crime scene was no more than 1 to 2 years old. Further rehydration studies of the crime scene moss and specimen common pocket moss under controlled conditions and its growth cycle led scientists to deduce that the moss must have been buried within the last 6 months from the time of police discovery. So the end conclusion regarding the moss was that the moss must have been buried that year, spending no more than 3 seasons, spring, summer, fall of that year underground. The 4 suspects were hired back in 2007, a full 2 years before the crime was discovered. Therefore, the bodies must have been deposited after the 4 employees were hired by Burr Oaks Cemetery, disproving the timeline of events stated by the defense, leading to their prosecution and the passing of new laws regarding cemeteries in America. I found this a really interesting article and definitely recommend to you reading it for yourselves. Thank you for listening. Kyle, the Angry Archaeologist.